May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. In our first lesson this morning, we have Moses leading his flock beyond the wilderness. We have jumped forward a number of years from his birth story, which we heard last week. And our story this morning picks up after he has fled to Midian from Egypt, where he had killed an Egyptian guard who was beating an Israelite. He marries, he has a son, and works as a shepherd for his father-in-law. He has settled into a new life, yet he names his son Gershom. For, he says, I have been an alien residing in a foreign land. Moses is not completely at home here. And during this time back in Egypt, the Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. And out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. And God, hearing their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. And God says to Moses here, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land. God took notice of them. And the story of Moses' encounter with God is not just about one man's encounter with the divine. This was initiated in God's people calling out to God to be released from their bondage. And God tapping Moses as just the person to pull this off. When Moses asks, whom shall he tell the Israelites is sending him? God responds, I am who I am. Or as it can also be translated, I will be what I will be. Do not try to box me in. And this voice asks him to go back to Egypt to rescue a few 100,000 slaves and to lead them back through the desert toward freedom, freedom in a new land, not a small task. Moses had gotten off the path, and when God saw that this man had turned aside, God called to him. Over these past 3 years, we have experienced being beyond the wilderness, being off the familiar path of how we had always done things, and being forced out of our familiar daily patterns of our usual busyness. We were able to turn aside and see and hear and pay attention to the cries of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tyree Nichols, and God's call to us to respond. What are you going to do about all of this? And I know that for many, you have been seeing and hearing and experiencing and responding to this cry as well as this call, responding for a lifetime. For God has heard the cries of God's people, and God calls each and every one of us. Yet so often our question remains, who am I that I should do this? But God's response is always the same. I will be with you. Harriet Tubman was called Moses with good reason. When she liberated herself from enslavement on September 17, 1849, she was aided by members of the Underground Railroad. But to her, freedom felt empty unless she could share it with people she loved. So she resolved to go back and rescue friends and family. And she did. Ultimately, she liberated 70 people over about 13 trips, never losing one passenger on the railroad, traveling in the dark of night, guided by her deep faith and the light of the North Star. The Reverend Dr. Wilda Gaffney, an Episcopal priest and biblical scholar, writes, God told Moses that God's people's cry had not fallen on deaf ears. My ancestors clung to that promise. They put their faith in the God of Moses. When hope is kindled into faith, not just belief, but a living faith, Gaffney reflects, we discover that our cries do not fall on deaf ears, and that we are never alone in our sorrow, grief, or illness. We discover desperate circumstances need not leave us hopeless. We discover that there is something miraculous in us that enables us to survive the unthinkable. We discover that there is power in us to transform the world. And we start by making sure everyone has the same chance for life and liberty. How we change our world and break out of some of the cycles that imprison and enslave us is to see our salvation bound up with the liberation of each other. For God has heard the cries of God's people and calls each and every one of us. We might not see ourselves as the stuff of heroes, leading hundreds of thousands out of slavery, but perhaps we can see that our salvation is bound up with the liberation of each other. Perhaps we can share that light and love and fullness of life with one person at a time. I was very sorry to share with you at the beginning of our service this morning that Bob, the founder and director of Visions, a recovery play on addiction, had died on Friday. And again, thank you for keeping Bob and his family and the Visions family in your prayers. The Visions Theater Group has met on Wednesday nights here at St. Mark's for a number of years now. And I had the honor and privilege of getting to know Bob a bit through that time. And Bob also joined us sometimes on Sunday mornings for worship, often with Paul. Bob was deeply committed to the holy work of recovery, and his love of life and beautiful, warm spirit, and that smile certainly shone through and touched so many lives, touched so many of us. Last winter, I was invited to attend a performance of Visions here at St. Mark's. And as I shared with Bob and Paul after that, I was so deeply moved by the amazing spirit and energy and love that were shared by everyone in that space. The actors, the crew, and those who had come to support them. It was all quite palpable. And the spirit and energy and love of Visions has blessed St. Mark's over the years. Bob was one person who had experienced God's liberating grace and life. And he just had to share that with others. I believe he wanted everyone to know that that grace and that life and that love exists and is available to everyone. God hears the cries of God's people, and God calls each and every one of us to respond. God does not call you to be Moses or to be Harriet Tubman. God calls you to be you, to live into the fullness of your God-given gifts, to bring hope and healing, light and love to our hurting world. Amen. Amen.